So if you've never seen this before, this is actually what people refer to as the IAAA, right? That's identity, authentication, authorization, and accounting or accountability. And that IAAA is typically, when we're on a network, that's typically what we are able to do to interact with a network. So this is important because Microsoft, in or around 2000, they created what they called the new technology. And this new technology, essentially what they called it was NT, allowed Microsoft to create this server, this Windows server, that you installed a service on that server, and that service that's running there is an application called Active Directory. And so what Active Directory does is it allows you to create for a company a domain. And pay attention here, because this is a little different. This is a different type of domain than just mapping your URL to your IP address. Okay? So this domain here that I'm talking about, the notion of this quote-unquote domain in Microsoft's new technology, what they did is they allowed a hierarchical model to be created. And this hierarchical model kind of looks like this right here. Some people call it a parent-child relationship. For brevity purposes, this is what I'm going to, each one of these underneath it. And, you know, for whatever domain you create, let's say it's Cyber Protects, do you want to be part of my domain, my realm of trust, right? Then you have to be in what's called the directory server. And that directory server, usually in 90%, I think I was reading an article that said, in Forbes, that said that 90% of the world runs Active Directory. 90% of the world. So if you're not Microsoft certified, you may want to look into that. That might be something of interest. But if you've never heard about this before, then maybe I think it's becoming a legacy, if you will. Let me just see here if I can find one. So growing up, you know, I always had these things that would get delivered out on, you know, the driveway. And you may or may not know what these are, but essentially it's a white page. And in this white page, right? Now I remember back when I was in middle school, in this white page, what I would be able to do is I'd be able to look at this big-ass book, right? This massive book here that they would just throw out, kind of like the newspaper, onto your driveway. And in there, when I was in middle school, if there was a hot girl that was sitting next to me, I'd know her last name, and I'd know the vicinity that she lived in. And you could potentially look up the last name, know the vicinity of where that person lived, and then you would see their phone number. You know? So If you asked a girl for her phone number, you could verify it, whether it's in there, or maybe you want to crank call, right? Because caller ID didn't really exist. And by doing that, this white pages here allows us a way that will tell us everything about anybody that we want to know. And so the metaphor here that typically you'll hear people talk about directory servers, and more importantly, I'll write it one more time here, Microsoft Active Directory. The metaphor usually you'll hear people utilize here is a white page. Okay? And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. If you already know this, then just bear with me here, because this is something that I think everybody needs to know. And so what we would do whenever we create this domain here, the domain is essentially going to be an Active Directory server. So it's a Windows server. It's an Active Directory server. And you probably, if you've been working in the business for a little while, you probably know what I'm talking about. If not, then Microsoft will charge you, I don't know, $1,500 for you to buy a licensed copy of their server. And then you can utilize the add-on to install directory services and create a domain. And by creating a domain, it allows us to utilize directory services, but more importantly, it allows us to utilize single sign-on. And before Microsoft did that, before Microsoft got with the guys at MIT that came up with the idea of single sign-on, and I think that they paid them to create it and brought them on board, and I don't know what else the rest of the story is, but essentially the single sign-on behind the scenes here is using Kerberos. All right? And what it's doing is it can create tickets for anybody who is authenticated to the system. And it's kind of cool. If you've never seen this drawn out, this is something that I'm pretty good at here. Being able to, before the single sign-on, it was kind of like using the workspace option now. If you've ever created a workspace in Windows before, before Active Directory and you could create domains, which meant that, hey, you could be connected in a workspace to a bunch of different machines, but anytime you would connect to any of the machines, you would have to re-authenticate, which is a pain in the butt. If you need to go over to a file server over there, maybe you need to go over to an email server over there, you got to go out through an internet proxy over here, so each time we're having to log in, and that's not ideal. So with the idea of this domain, what we typically will see in this domain is an Active Directory Microsoft server, and it is typically controlled by this thing that's called a domain, you guessed it, controller. And that's literally what it's called. And we call that DC, the DC for short. Right? So you can have n number of domain controllers, but what that does is if you can control the domain, what does that mean? Pretty much you got access to everything. So you can create as many as you want, and I put in there, of these domain controllers, but usually you don't want very many of them, right? Because these domain controllers are essentially root on the domain. It's root on the domain. So literally it controls the domain. Usually these are high-end machines that have high fault tolerance, Because if we got 100 people that are authenticating to the Active Directory, it's probably not a problem, right? If we got 80,000 people that are authenticating to the directory server, or I don't know, somebody like Facebook, 4 million a day, right? 1 billion a day, right? 1 billion. I think it was like 4 million every 10 seconds or something crazy like that last time I looked. But essentially what ends up happening here is we can build this hierarchical model with Active Directory using this Microsoft. It's been around for a long time now, but and there's a reason why I'm rewriting it here. They called it new technology. Because Microsoft, you guessed it, they created their own hash, right, to store passwords. That was called the NTLM. It still is called the NTLM. I think they're actually on version 3 now because they've had some security flaws with 1 and 2. New technology is NT, and then LM is LAN Manager. LAN Manager. And essentially what this does here, by us creating this domain, is it creates, remember I was just talking about before, this realm of trust. So any user and computer, and I want to emphasize that, any user and computer that is added to the domain, any user or computer that's added to the domain is in the realm of trust. And let's say here that you have a Windows machine. And if you don't, then just go with me. If you have a Windows machine, you want to join the domain, you have to send a request to the domain, and then you have to be provided credentials to the domain, and then usually you can join the domain. And once you join the domain, then some additional things happen. But first and foremost, what I want to show you here is at a high level, and I'm going to try to keep this at an operational view, so we'll just say an OV1. If we're talking DODAF, anybody in the DoD might know what that is. The architectural framework, operational view, that's 10,000 foot view. Okay? If we just keep it at a 10,000 foot view here, if we're joining this CyberProtect's domain, remember the domain's like that big ass phone book that we talked about before. What we're going to do is we're going to organize the domain with the taxonomy. Right? And I hear the trumpets going on in the background there. The taxonomy, which is basically the schema and the naming conventions. Right? How are we going to make sure that you do the right thing? I'm going to lock you down. But also when you're creating files, this is what the file needs to be called.
Isn't this similar to what Google did with Google Docs and the Google Slides and all that? Because if you want to send out those slides to people that give them access, they will request access.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, so basically they're joining the realm of trust, and absolutely. That's actually a SPIML request that's going out to automatically provision, right? But wait, there's more. There's more, right? So with these organizational units, and I'm going to write this over here, the OU, and if I'm going too slow, then feel free to take a nap because I don't have to sit for the test. But this is probably one of the most important things that kind of brings everything together like the glue. These organizational units, after I show it and after I draw it out, it'll make more sense. This might be HR, this might be finance, this might be IT, and how about we just call this the bennies? So the benefits, no pun intended, with Big Benny, right? So we got HR, finance, IT, and benefits. Well, if it's organized into these different organizational units, we call them departments, but the directory server calls it an OU. Well, underneath that, what we can do is we can create these, it's an abstract concept. We can create these objects underneath. And so let's say that I bring you on underneath the IT department, the ITOU. So I bring you on day one. What I would do is, I'd have an app over here, maybe some sort of workflow. If I was a hiring manager, right? So the hiring manager would use a workflow that connects to Active Directory and then goes down and will provision a new account into whichever department you belong to. And so this workflow may run on something like SharePoint. Right? Microsoft SharePoint. If you've never used that, then and then what SharePoint does is it'll send over a SAML request, and then once it sends back, and then it'll say, yep, go ahead, I'm ready, I'm listening. Then it'll go and send a SPIML request, and then this will give you a SPIML response, like whether it was good or not, right? And this is a SAML response right here. I love this pen because it is even more accurate than when I write on the board up here. So the workflow for the hiring manager will send out the assertion that, hey, I want to create an account, and I want to provision the account. There's that key word, dun, 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 again. And it needs to be in the ITOU. So what I would do is I would create this unique identifier that we call the distinguished name. And this distinguished name, commonly referred to as, you guessed it, the DN. The DN. And so this distinguished name is a unique ID. So there's a number of different things that this unique ID can be, but Microsoft, when they started it, would give you what's called an NT login. So if you have a login like B. McGee, I don't necessarily need to use the @cyberprotects.com. I can authenticate with my NT login, B. McGee, or I can use my email address, right? So either one of them here, with this distinguished name, it's got to be something unique. And so, this object here that I create would be DN equal to B. McGee. Okay? So pay attention. I'm sorry, go ahead. So the distinguished name is a unique ID. What they call it in directory services is a distinguished name, but essentially it's like a primary key in a database, or a unique ID. It's a way that we can say that Shane is Shane is Shane is Shane, right? And that's why a lot of times you'll see Shane, and then you'll see Shane 1, or Ben 1, Obi 1. That's something different, totally different. But whatever that taxonomy is, whatever that naming convention is, really you got to keep it consistent, right? And so inside of this object, I'm not done yet. Please, 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 just give me a few minutes so you don't have to rewatch the video here. But if you think of this as a unique object within the directory, what I can start to do is I can start to add attributes to this unique object. Right? I can add adders to this unique object. So give me an example of an attribute. Say it again. What'd you say? Tall, dark, and handsome. Okay. You're getting way too advanced. Okay? Hold on. We're going to get there. But before we even do that, all I know is B McGee. What attributes can I associate with this object? So I have a blank object, right? Let's say a cup. You know, inside the cup, I got to start filling it up with stuff. What am I going to fill it with? Here in the directory that keeps the list of everybody who works for me, now I got to start filling that object. What do I fill it with? Okay, so fingerprint, sure, you could, right? So first things first, right? Maybe give me your social. Give me your social. Give me your first name. Give me your last name. Right? Give me your DOB. Give me your adder, your address. Right? Definitely an email address would be associated to this right here. And this is probably enough to get the party started, right? So if we're utilizing the principle of least privilege here, principle and you will see that on the test. Sometimes they call it a need to know. Sometimes we call it a need to know. The principle of least privilege or the need to know, I mean, that's all we really need to get this thing going, right? Because maybe all they need access to is an email, right? Maybe that's all they need. Well, as things go on and you become more valuable to a company, what we can do is we can take that introductory data that we have right here, right? This need to know, this basic object that we've gone through and done. And now we can begin, I'm going to do a different color here, we can begin to provision what's called metadata. Metadata, which is essentially, we call it data, I know it sounds silly, data about data. Which is kind of funny. Well, I think it is. But over here, just like Kelsey was just saying, here, is we may start to put different types of roles in here. Maybe we put in here specific permissions. Maybe we put, other associated things that takes this object here that we still have, right? This DN B McGee. The main information is this right here. And the metadata about that, so it's data about data, right? So it's linked dynamically to the original object here. We mind meld them together and it becomes relevant. It becomes relevant because now that you've actually joined the domain, right? Your manager's provisioned your account the way that he provisions it or she provisions it, right? It comes and it actually will send that SPML request here and it'll add that object. Well, maybe on down the road you get a promotion 2 years from now and they want you to go in and be a system administrator. So then there'll be another form that the manager fills out that will have this same SAML and SPML request sent to the directory server, and what it'll do is it'll start to add permissions, like, for instance, the admin. So if you wanted to add the admin here, now that person could be provisioned the admin. And then now what that means is when you go and try to utilize your computer here, that's absolutely horrible. Sorry, guys. So if you try to, you know what I'm going to do here? Hold on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, over here, underneath another OU, I'm going to link it up to this right here. Users and computers. Because what we can do is we can put your computer in the domain. We can join your computer to the domain, your actual whatever you're using, and we can link as metadata that Ben McGee owns this asset. And so now these two pieces of metadata are linked to each other. That way, when I come in the morning and I power on my machine here, that's supposed to be a laptop. I power on my machine, it prompts me, it challenges me to put in the identity and the authentication. Right? And the authentication is going to be something you know, something you have, or something you are. Those are the three things that we typically look at. Two of these would be called two-factor authentication, or, I think we talked about this the other day, a strong type of authentication. After you've authenticated, using one means or another, then the next part, just like the last slide says here, we authorize. So what is that person authorized to do? Well, they come in, they'll authenticate to Active Directory. Kerberos will allow that person to sign on, and they create a ticket. So then now this person, machine here that's been authenticated, has this ticket that we don't see. It's in the background. And basically, what can this person do while they're on the domain? What can they access? And that would be inside of the metadata to say what can they access. Can they access this printer? Can they access this file share? Can they access SharePoint, maybe Microsoft Teams, Skype, whatever. So this computers can be a number of different computers or not. And why do I mention this? Well, if we go back to that federation, you know, between two different organizations here, A and B, so A will likely have this same scenario going on in their neck of the woods. They'll have an Active Directory domain controller. B will as well. And in order for these two to trust each other, we got to exchange some sort of trust object between the two. And usually that's a key that goes back and forth. So from that, now this federation is created. And what we typically can see with federations is we can begin to use open authentication. And so if you adhere to open authentication, or OAuth, not to be confused with Olaf from Do You Want to Build a Snowman, but OAuth, what's the name of that movie? I've seen it 1,000 times. Frozen. Thank you. I appreciate that. I knew somebody would know it. But you can use this OAuth to see if that Active Directory trusts whatever you're trying to log in with. So the example that someone said earlier was, well, what about Gmail? What about Google? Well, what about them? They have something like this underneath it. Whether or not they're using a Microsoft product, it'd be funny if they were. But most corporations out there are using a Microsoft product. Some sort of directory server on the back end that essentially will house all of those unique identities for those people and then extend that out. Right? They do. They do. So Oracle runs on the Unix platform. So Oracle bought Sun. Sun had the biggest competitor to Microsoft, and that was Sun's directory server. So Oracle bought Sun probably 10 years ago, and Sun directory server is what we used to use at NASA. And so now it's Oracle directory server. And that's one of the biggest competitors to Microsoft. And a lot of times you see them integrated together, like, you know, to actually create the domain, and especially in the DoD world, you'll have a domain in Active Directory, but then if you have a big data warehouse and that team bought an Oracle product. Well, now these engineers over here have to figure out how to talk to the domain controller so we can pop our CAC in there one time, and then we don't have to keep putting it in the pen, you know? Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, it becomes a little bit of a rat's nest if I just kind of look back here, you know, everything that we've kind of covered. But this is really the glue of everything within the Security Plus. Because the computers not only are laptops, but we can also add, let me write that on here. It's laptops, it's cell phones, it's network devices. So literally everything is in here, and it's all talking back and forth. And so if we throw a sniffer, and I think I'll probably just end it on this right here. If I throw a sniffer, let me see if I can draw a nose. Right? If I have a sniffer here, and this sniffer, let's say Wireshark. I'm sniffing traffic in Wireshark. Like if you guys were to bring up Wireshark right now, you probably would see it. What's going on behind the scenes here in a Microsoft Active Directory server is Wireshark will start picking up SNMP traffic, Simple Network Management Protocol, and that'll be from, you know, machine to machine, but everything trying to keep the network in sync. Open Shores path first, you know, being able to use routing information protocol. Where's the border? So like the border gateway protocol. So the SNMP will help to manage that. But these network devices, if you're still sniffing on the network, will be sending out ARP requests and RARP requests. So they have the IP, they're looking for the MAC. Right? They have the MAC, they're looking for the IP. And so it all kind of comes together here. Active Directory, why it is so popular is because it is a single pane of glass that we can control the network. And they call it a domain controller. We control the network, last thing, through these things called group policy. And a lot of times those are referred to as GPO, Group Policy Object, because the object, just like I said here, goes in an Active Directory.